Thank you so much for coming. My name's Lisa Marginelli. I'm with the New America Foundation, where I run an energy policy advisory committee that's looking at all of the different energy initiatives that are going on at the moment with the Obama administration and trying to think about them in a slightly bigger way. We're here today to talk about clean tech after the stimulus. Now, the stimulus spending on clean tech is roughly $50 billion. The spending is about to hit the economy. It's over the past year, people at the DOE, including Sanjay Weigel, who's here, have worked mightily to get it out, to get it poised to go into the economy. It's all sort of poised to flow this year. We're looking at perhaps 100,000 jobs created in clean energy through the stimulus spending, many more indirectly. And the question really is, we've taken this big leap. $50 billion is a lot of money. What happens as the spending hits the economy and afterwards? What do we do afterwards? How do we maintain this momentum? And so we've assembled this wonderful panel here today. Immediately to my right is Congressman Tom Perriello from the 5th District of Virginia. He has a number of stimulus projects in his district. He's been a great champion of clean tech projects and kind of a visionary in the sense of how clean tech can work on the ground level and kind of at the community level in the U.S. for economic revitalization. He also has a background as a national security consultant in places like West Africa, which I imagine gives a person a real sense of the role of resources in conflict and social issues. We also have on the panel, we have Sanjay Weigel, who I mentioned. He is the Renewable Energy Advisor for the Recovery Act energy programs at the Department of Energy. He comes here from nearly a decade as a venture capitalist in California, working specifically in the field of clean tech and renewable energy, and before that with the World Bank. We also have Bill Tyndall, who's the Senior Vice President of Federal Policy with Duke Energy. Bill has many years of experience in the utility industry, but he also has done a tremendous amount of work with carbon and thinking about reducing emissions in a sort of business-like way. He worked with Natural Source and other places. He also worked in the House and the Energy Committee. And finally, we also have Amy Christensen, who is the CEO of Christensen Global Strategies. She worked with the DOE on Latin American policy in the 90s and has had a long career working in places as varied as the World Bank. In carbon finance. She's also been an advisor to Google, and she's the co-founder of the Clean Economy Network and is also a member of the American Council on Renewable Energy. So I wanted to get started quickly by talking about, we've put out $50 billion and it's gone out into communities. I wanted to get the congressman to talk a little bit about what's happened as the stimulus money has gone into his district and also, what's at stake? What is at stake as we look towards maintaining momentum? I know that one of the projects in your district is a biodiesel, or several involve biodiesel, and what we have now is biodiesel tax credits have lapsed since January 1st, and that's this sort of, it's one of the little pieces that contributes towards momentum in this area. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience and what's at stake.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for putting this panel together as a forward-looking panel, but understanding a little bit of where we've come from in the last year is important for moving forward. Thanks to everyone who's on the panel for all of your leadership in various ways and being very constructive members of this conversation. A little bit about what we've done with the stimulus on energy in my area and a little bit of where I think next steps are. My district, for those who don't know, is about 9,000 square miles of central and southern Virginia. So it has very high-tech, high-growth areas like Charlottesville, where the University of Virginia is. We don't have the city of Lynchburg, but we skirt around it, where a lot of the nuclear industry is located. I'll talk about that in a second. And then we have a huge swath of counties that are old manufacturing belt, textiles, furniture, and ag with tobacco. So we have a district, I have a district that in many ways mirrors the country in terms of having the full range of kind of economic activities and things related to energy. Some of the things that we've been able to get support for include several methane capture projects on landfills in poor counties, where we will be able to see savings within a 12 to 16 month turnaround time on methane capture from landfills. Martinsville has been the most noted one, in part because there's over 20% unemployment in the city of Martinsville. But we're also seeing in Mecklenburg and Halifax and a number of other areas, again, an upfront investment that is going to continue to save ratepayers and taxpayers over time. We've also worked with the third largest dairy farm in the state of Virginia, the Vanderhyde Farm in Pittsylvania County, basically to turn tens of thousands of tons of manure every month into power. In fact, into both power and low phosphorus fertilizer offshoots. So we're dealing with both the issues of energy and clean bay, nitrification issues and other things in the same space. So here we're going to farmers and saying, we're going to take what is often your largest and certainly your most volatile cost, your energy price, and turn it into a revenue stream. I was standing in the construction site, which the good news and bad news is the construction has already begun on what is really the size of a large gymnasium that will be the anaerobic digester on that farm. The bad news is that we are in a little bit of a holding pattern because banks are still not lending even. There's a whole lot of stuff we can get into where in some ways the private sector lending part of this has not moved as quickly, ironically, as the government side in making some of these things happen. But in the same way that for a farm of thousands heads, a dairy farm with just enormous number of a huge volume of manure on it, you can take requires an anaerobic digester the size of a gymnasium. Well, computers used to fill up the size of a gymnasium, and now we hold them in the palm of our hand. And I think what we're looking at right now is the front end of a technological wedge where what currently may make sense for a dairy of that size will eventually make sense for a dairy even of 25, 50 head of cattle once that technology comes to scale. We've also worked with a guy who runs a truck stop where he sells diesel fuel to Big Mac trucks. And he decided after 9/11 that he was essentially just being a salesman for Al-Qaeda, and he didn't like it. 3 cents on every dollar spent at his tank stayed in the community, and everything else went elsewhere, much of it to countries that don't like us very much. So he decided that he had to be part of this biodiesel revolution, and we now have a project with turning canola oil, he's already selling it at the pump, a high cetane premium fuel, not a reduction of quality but an increase of quality in the fuel, and over 90 cents of every dollar spent at the tank stays in the community. So part of what we're looking at with the projects that I think have come out of the stimulus and are going on in general right now is not just the idea of moving from one fuel source to another. Will it be wind, solar, biomass, nuclear, what's going to be the winner, as much as rethinking scale and thinking about new innovations in this field. So we're talking about this idea of how if you were to franchise, for example, the biodiesel plant, you wouldn't do it by getting bigger and bigger in terms of that one truck stop. It's that you would start truck stops around the area, each of which could pop up where there's enough canola oil production within a 30-mile radius of that tank. So we're talking about how we take things to scale, which I think is significant while there's a conversation going on about too big to fail. So there are very exciting projects going on, and I think part of why we were successful in Southern Virginia is that rather than say, here's one project, fund it, we actually pitched the whole region. We brought everyone together, the engineers, the economic development professionals, the business leaders, and said, let's talk about how to turn this area from being the former tobacco capital to the future clean energy capital. And instead of competing one county against another, how can we help define this region as a place that's worth investing in? I've probably talked too long, so let me just say one thing in closing, and we can move to other things. In terms of where we are right now, we have some very exciting projects that help show that this is not some academic idea. This is very real for farmers, for manufacturers. We also have done some advanced battery manufacturing, some other things. What we need right now more than anything else are a couple of things. One, predictability. Frankly, whether it ends up being cap and trade or a tax shift or a regulatory scheme or anything else, what investors are looking at right now, they're holding cash in the energy sector because they need to know what the rules are going to be. Once we give them the rules, they will figure out how to make money on it and figure out how to innovate. But the lack of predictability, because the Senate isn't moving, is really choking up this area. So whatever we end up with as a national energy strategy, we need to figure it out so that then people can adjust to that. Second, we need to look more at the game changers. I think that it would have been a better use of about half the stimulus money to rebuild the entire electric grid as a smart grid in this country. But game changer technologies like that are going to be significant. And third, making sure that we're finding out sustained ways to reward innovation instead of bailing out failure, not just in the Wall Street context, but right down the road, of saying not just a one-time investment, but how is this sending a signal to the market, to our entrepreneurs, to our farmers, that if you continue to invent in this area, if you continue to innovate, you're going to be rewarded for it, which is in part the predictability point, in part the infrastructure point, and in part just an investment in innovation. With that, I'll pass on.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things that you bring up that's really important is the issue of predictability, and how do you assure that predictability and continued momentum, a continued ability to get investment in the market. You can't. It's easy to overlook the things that create predictability, because sometimes they're sort of weird little things like a tax credit here or some sort of loan guarantee there. They may not seem all that large. In this case, we really are looking at a huge need for a carbon bill, but there are a lot of other sort of moving parts to creating predictability and really unleashing private capital in this sphere. Before we kick off into the rest of this conversation, I would say that, a big cautionary tale for me comes from California, which is where I work. In the 80s, the state put an enormous amount of money into wind and solar, an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of kind of intellectual capital into building up a network of wind and solar that was fairly successful and had some really innovative ideas, especially the thermal solar in the deserts. But the failure to consistently renew the tax credits at the end of the year and allowing them to expire created a very erratic capital investment cycle, which eventually along with a falling price for the electricity, killed the whole industry. And it's not just that it killed the industry, it's that it actually was bought elsewhere, and it moved overseas. And what we see now is that we have a situation in the U.S. where we are investing a lot, but 90% of the market for clean tech is actually overseas. So one of the things that's going to happen, and one of the things I want to discuss in this conversation, is how we kind of move from an investment strategy on the government's part to thinking more in terms of market development, clusters, which you mentioned, the idea of clustering clustering groups that are working on similar projects, and kind of trying to think, for policymakers to think in a slightly different vein than they've been thinking in, more towards deployment and a little bit less towards investment and some of the traditional instruments. But what I'd like to do now is talk to Sanjay Wagle, who has been working on the investment furiously for more than a year, to just give us a sense of where we are in the stimulus spending and what we can expect over the next year.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. And first, it was great to hear the congressman talk about how the Recovery Act programs are working in his district. I mean, I think you pointed to over half a dozen programs that are actively impacting communities there. So that's always great to hear. So where are we with the Recovery Act? It's been 14 months since the Recovery Act was passed, and the $787 billion came in three parts. Two of the parts, about 2/3 of the total, started to happen really quickly. It was tax credits, about 1/3, and another 1/3 in direct relief to families, the unemployed, and states. And that started to be seen in checks and paychecks right away. The last 1/3 is the part that Department of Energy fits within, which is investments in infrastructure and technology to lay the foundation for a more competitive economy. And the department has about $36.7 billion in appropriations under the Recovery Act. When you include tax credits and loan guarantees, it adds up to about $80 billion in investments. And put that in context, the normal annual budget of the department is about $25 billion, of which 2/3 is managing the legacy nuclear fleet, civilian and military nuclear management and cleanup. That leaves about $8 billion a year for energy spending, traditionally R&D focused, compared to $80 billion over 2 years. So that's a 5x increase in spending, which we're trying to do in a quarter the normal time from appropriations to spending. And so quite a challenge. So fast forward 14 months, where are we? Of the $32.7 billion in grants, we're 98% of that, so $32 billion, has been allocated to about 3,500 projects around the country that were competitively bid and applied for, highly oversubscribed, about 3 to 1 on average. About 85% obligated, meaning contracted, spending procedures approved and ready to spend, and about 10% spent. And what that means is we spent 2009 setting this up, issuing competitive solicitations, receiving about 10,000, 11,000 applications, bringing in 4,500 expert reviewers who spent 100,000 person hours reviewing them and selecting the best projects, then contracting, and that gets us to now when the real spending starts. So we'll see the bulk of the spending and job creation of this third leg of the Recovery Act happening in 2010. Of course, it'll continue for another year or so after that, but we'll see the bulk of it in this year. The tax credits, about $6 billion has gone out already for Recovery Act tax credits for energy, both for manufacturing and project deployment, and about $20 billion of loan guarantees. So lots happened already. Lisa mentioned the jobs figure, but that's the jobs to date based on just 10% of the spending. So what should we expect that this will achieve? We talk about 7 pillars that we're trying to put a down payment on, right? Because the Recovery Act was always going to be a one-shot deal, right? We're now entering a flat budget environment. So the idea was to make investments that would be catalytic, that would achieve a step change together with mobilizing a lot of private capital that then the private sector could continue with afterwards. So what were we hoping to achieve? I'll mention some of them quickly. One of them is transforming our transportation sector to reduce our dependence on oil and to make a big difference in that. And what our Recovery Act programs are doing are really investing in a competition among different technologies and approaches, including advanced biofuels, electric vehicles and batteries, and advanced and more efficient traditional combustion vehicles. And you can see those technologies compete with each other. Ultimately, you can see them converge together in plug-in hybrids that use electric motors and batteries, that also run on cellulosic biofuels, and that have more efficient engines in them. So that's one big pillar. It'll help us achieve our goal of putting 1 million plug-in hybrids on the road by 2015 and achieving a new CAFE standard of about 35.5 mpg by 2016. Another big area is doubling renewables. So as Lisa mentioned, the markets for renewables have been largely overseas. We led the world in the 1980s, and then the market started growing overseas, and of course manufacturing was based overseas. Our goal is to double both deployment of renewables in the U.S. compared to where it is now, and to double manufacturing, to make sure that we lead the world in these fast-growing industries. And it's nice to see that despite the financial and economic downturn, we're actually on track to achieve both those goals, probably to exceed them. And the 2009 could have actually been a very tough year for renewables. It was looking like renewables deployment would have been about half of what it had been the year before. And thanks to Recovery Act programs, people in industry say they credit those programs with having a banner year in 2009. So 10 gigawatts of wind, largest number ever, which put us actually, put the U.S. on top of the world in terms of renewables deployed in that year and total installed base of renewables, surpassing Germany on both counts.
So can you, and this is an incredibly broad and ambitious program that has really, one of the things that's wonderful about it is when you delve into the depths of how this stimulus spending was done, it was done in a very sort of smart, strategic, thoughtful manner. They brought in people who had nobody has a tremendously long career in this subject in the U.S., but they brought in people who had been working in it, such as yourself, for many years. And I wonder, one of the things that we discussed is that soon the DOE is going to kind of close up shop. It's going to close up this stimulus spending shop. No, it's not going to close up, but it'll still be there. But it's not going to be spending money. So what's the next? So where are we kind of in this cycle? And if you could comment briefly on that, and then we'll go on to some of the other panelists.
Right. So I think the idea is it was a one-shot deal. Were we able to spend on investments that would be catalytic, that the private sector would be able to continue with? Because you're right, Lisa. I mean, after the Recovery Act ends September 30th of this year for new projects, we go back to a regular budget environment, $8 billion a year. You can still do a lot with $8 billion. That's not nothing. But, it's 1/5 of what we're talking about for the Recovery Act.
And it must be mentioned that China is apparently spending $9 billion a month.
Right.
That's the number that
to put it in context of the need, if we really are serious about transforming our economy to a more competitive and clean economy, compare it to the NASA moonshot. So that was $200 billion in the 1960s. In 1960 dollars, $200 billion over 10 years. We would have to continue the Recovery Act level of spending for 10 years to really achieve a moonshot type transformation. And, it seems like China is serious about that. But I'll give you an example of what I mean by a catalytic investment that the private sector can continue with. So geothermal, right? Geothermal in the United States is about 3 gigawatts installed compared to 24 gigawatts for wind. Hasn't really taken off in a big way yet, and we've only tapped the near-surface hotspots. But it has fully as much potential as wind, possibly even more if you talk about deep geothermal. We just haven't tapped it. Why? Because it's very risky to explore for geothermal. When you drill for oil, that's risky too, but what you get out is oil. That's pretty valuable. When you drill for geothermal, what you get out is heat. Not quite as valuable. So the risk is compounded. What the Recovery Act did was to invest $400 million in cost-shared grants for drilling programs that would be the first well in a new field, but using innovative exploration and drilling technologies. So the idea is if you prove out new fields and simultaneously prove out new exploration and drilling technologies, perhaps transferring some of those technologies from the oil and gas field, you can have a catalytic impact that then you can develop the rest of those fields and you can apply and replicate those technologies all across the industry. So hopefully the private sector can then pick up where the Recovery Act left off.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to quickly move to Amy Christensen. One of the things that we talked about that was sort of the catalyst for this panel was you mentioned the cliff. That as we come to the end of the stimulus spending, how do we plan for the next thing? It's great to have geothermal in the ground. It's great to have things above the ground that can capture the geothermal, but how do we actually get it onto the grid? And Amy, maybe you can talk just briefly about what's at stake and what the cliff is. What are people talking about?
Sure. Over the past few years, through my role with the Clean Economy Network as well as with the American Council on Renewable Energy, we've been working a lot with the companies. These are the new companies in this area. This is where the job creation is. So stepping back, when we talk about stimulus, economic development, let's be clear that this sector is one of the few sectors that's actually creating jobs. And a study by an institute at the University of Massachusetts showed that for every dollar invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency, it creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than the oil and gas industry does. So these are the new job creators, the new businesses. From 1980 to 2005, companies less than 5 years old created net 40 million new jobs. So this is where we need to be making the investments. But what does happen after the stimulus dollars run out? We have to have a regulatory framework framework in place to allow that private investment to come off the sidelines. We're hearing this consistently, and I advise investors from venture capitalists to commercial investments, so all up and down the finance chain, and what they're saying is until we see this predictability, we're not coming to the United States. So we have sovereign wealth funds investing dramatically in China alongside their $9 billion a month because they have predictability of policies in place. They know the Chinese are going to do to the greatest extent possible what they say they're going to do. In the United States, they're just not seeing that, and they're being very clear about that. That's what they're telling us, and their money certainly isn't flowing yet. And also you have the utilities, and let Bill speak to that, but who also are significant investors, obviously. As they're regulated, they make the investments in putting these new clean technologies into place, and again, they're waiting for that regulatory framework. So I'd say the most important thing that I'm at least hearing from both the clean tech companies, the investors, and some of the utilities is we need that the rules of the road. We need to know which sectors we're investing in. Is it a renewable electricity standard? Is it a clean electricity standard? What kind of tax credits are there? And then they can run the financial models and understand, okay, these are the sectors we're investing in, these are the technologies, and these are the states of those technologies. And we really need to be mobilizing not just that venture money, but that commercial money, that first money in after the stimulus money to really scale up these sectors. So that's number one. And I would say that it's a critical issue of competition as well. And it's not just the new clean tech, but it's also energy efficiency and competitiveness around saving money on this capital cost, on this ongoing cost of energy. So in the United States, we use 80% more energy than Northwestern Europe, 94% more than Japan, 7 times the level of China. And that's a cost that every company is paying, obviously, against its bottom line for energy. And so when people talk about we can't afford to act on climate change, we can't afford to act in creating this new clean economy, I would say we can't afford not to act because we're highly inefficient, and these other countries are investing in increasing energy efficiency, and that makes us less competitive. Finally, I would just say that a lot of the innovation that we're starting to see, in addition to the more traditional tax credits and stimulus investments that we're seeing, is a lot of innovation on the ground at the state and local level. And for instance, Governor Warner in Virginia has been putting in place some new cluster approaches to seeding these and incubating these new companies to help get them up and running. And I would just highlight that that's an area that we should be looking to, is learning from that innovation of taking the stimulus dollars on the ground, working with local private sector, determine where the opportunities are locally, and creating new investment structures around that.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's looming over all of this is, will we get a carbon price, and how soon? And I just want to take a kind of a quick poll. I mean, how many people think we're going to have a carbon price in motion within the next month or two?
In motion? Sure, in motion.
In motion. Okay. Are we going to have one in place by next year?
I think so. But I'm always an optimist. But I would just say that there was $100 billion a year in the global carbon markets, and that means $100 billion going into energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean technologies globally. And so let's remember that this market is a massive source of new funds in addition to the other funds we're talking about.
Increasingly, it's becoming a competitiveness issue. Bill Tyndall, I wonder if you could talk briefly about whether or not the carbon price is necessary to get to kind of move to a more stable market for this, for clean tech, from your perspective.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's necessary. I think it's a terrific accelerator. I mean, when I saw this topic, I have a very good friend who runs a clean tech venture capital fund in the Silicon Valley, and so I called him and I said, Mike, what do you think I should talk about given this topic of trying to accelerate clean tech post the stimulus? And my friend said, sitting in the Silicon Valley, he said, what we really need to do is raise energy costs for consumers. And sitting in the middle of the climate debates and trying to talk to senators about voting for a bill that has a 1% or whatever it would be, whether it's 1 or 10, any increase in their costs, and how very, very concerned and careful they are about that notion. I thought, well, there is a gap between, what would be in a perfect world for the financiers about getting this technology out there and what's reality. But having said that, I do think that the utilities right this second, prior to a climate bill, have a big role to play in this. I think we've been a leader on it, and our CEO Jim Rogers has been very aggressive about trying to take utility commissions that aren't on the, aren't California and aren't New Jersey and aren't some of the places where you think where there's a lot of organic push on this, and trying to talk to them about the advantages for Hoosiers and Tar Heels about having a structure that allows some of these technologies to get deployed. If you just look back at the utility model, it does have some advantages here. We already reach every single household. We already are organized really around neighborhoods and clusters because that's the way the distribution network works. And probably most important, we are a 100-year-old model for socializing new costs over a group of consumers. So when there is a new subdivision built, that new subdivision has never paid for the cost of extending the electricity to them. It's always been socialized over the whole system, and that model offers some opportunities here, whether it's smart grid or solar on the rooftop. And so we've been working very hard, and I won't go into all the details, but I mean we have a pilot program in North Carolina that's putting solar panels on households under a system where it's essentially Duke gives the homeowners a lease payment, and for us, we are indifferent. We get the same return whether we build that solar panel and install it and own that, or whether we build a power plant. And so that's, that lines up for our business model. There are other ways of doing it, but I mean, that's certainly one that works and seems to be working. And then on the smart grid, it's the same thing. I mean, we can start deploying that. There is an opportunity to do that on a gradual build out. We reach all the houses, and we got a wonderful grant from DOE to accelerate that. And if we can deliver reductions if the system works and it delivers reductions to the customers, we will be able to use that model to develop this smart grid. But we all have to perform. We all have to get those reductions so people see that, because there's an amazing amount of hostility that's turning up around replacing some 30-year-old mechanical meter with a smart meter. So
right. there's politics of the smart meter are fairly complex. Well, the electronics turn out to be relatively simple. I think this brings up an interesting question. I just want to, we're going to spend much of the rest of the conversation talking about the details of some of the things that we need to continue the momentum of clean tech. But what I want to do is step back for a minute and say, the stimulus is part of sort of a piecemeal approach to clean tech that we've taken in this country. We have the EPA is pushing carbon regulations. We have a multiplicity of different carbon initiatives in the House and the Senate. And we are kind of attacking it from a lot of different angles, including the Auto Rescue Task Force. And I'm wondering, do the panelists feel like we need a big overarching vision? When you look at what we need to do to tackle the carbon problem, or even to tackle it competitively, we need to really basically do the Industrial Revolution at 3 times the speed over the next 40 years. I mean, that's a big whoosh. And when you talk about it with young people, they get very excited because their whole career is going to be like being in a wind tunnel. But we don't seem to have quite that. We don't have an overarching, you don't necessarily get there with EPA regulations and sort of a lot of caution. You kind of need a big narrative and you need a big push. And I'm wondering whether people on the panel feel like we need to go big and whether we need a big story and what that is, or whether we can do this kind of through very careful buttressing from side to side. And I would lead off with the congressman on this topic.
Yes. Just one of the statistics that really stuck in my mind that was stated was that we're going to be spending $8 billion a year while China is spending $9 billion a month. This is not just in this area. There's similar numbers on high-speed rail, on a lot of technology. We continue to have a system where in a lot of countries we compete against, higher education is basically free, whereas here we basically tell people to take on $40,000 or $50,000 worth of debt so that they can then go into their adult life already upside down on their economics and other things. We aren't off by a little bit, we're off by a lot. And there are two ways to do it. You either come up with an overarching system that is a national energy policy and allow the market to drive a lot of things from there, which I think the private sector can do if we do the whether it's a tax shift or a cap or any number of systems that sends that signal to the market. It's not a coincidence that we're seeing the first nuclear reactors going out for bid in our lifetime. The signal of a price on carbon means that at Lake Ann in Virginia, at Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, and a number of other places, this is coming back. That was even before the loan guarantee extension went out. And when you look at that, and I just want to mention it for a quick second about nuclear, which I happen to be an advocate for as part of this equation, we have to be serious about the green jobs side of this, not on the level of, oh, isn't it nice that we can weatherize a home or two kind of green jobs. We have to be serious about being willing to say we want to build this technology here in the United States. If we're going to make a deal with the American people, and I'm talking about middle class, working class folks in this country where there is going to be some volatility in utility prices, we have to be offering them a job in return. It's not enough to just switch over to a solar panel. We do need that panel to be built here, and we need to accept the idea that that's not bad language. That's not a bad phrase to talk about making things here and having those jobs here. When we talk about taking weatherization to scale, which I think is one of the things we should have done at a massive scale this summer, is retrofitting of existing building stock, residential, commercial, and municipal. We've had a huge hit in the construction sector. People are ready to work. Most of the materials that go into weatherization are made here in the United States. You're putting real people on the job with real wages. It's not enough to have a LIHEAP program or a weatherization here or there like in the stimulus, although that was nice. We have to take it to scale. Duke has done a lot of great stuff, but Dominion Power in Virginia, in the town of Charlottesville, has done a forward funding program where they will pay for the house retrofit and then recoup that investment based on a reduced energy price. So instead of doing 10 or 20 a year, we can take that to $1,000, $2,000 a year because we know the return on investment is there, but we know homeowners right now don't have the $3,000 or $4,000 to put in to that retrofit. So we have to be thinking in terms of that type of leapfrog of scale in this situation, or we will just sit and watch this market exist elsewhere. So you either do it with one large thing which sends the signal to the market, and I still believe our private sector can out-compete and out-innovate, or if we don't have the guts to do that, we are going to have to do a lot of little things in a coordinated fashion with lots of carrots to get things moving here and there. But it's going to be tough to make that up unless we're willing to send a long-term signal, market signal, because the real investments here are ones that have 20-year, 30-year, 75-year considerations like a power plant investment. And in order to do that, if you send even the small signal, but nonetheless a clear one early, you're going to see these sorts of innovations. So I think if we're serious about this, we've got to be thinking on a grand scale.
I want to go on to the rest of the panel to answer that question, whether we can do it with grand or small. But I also think that there's a story here that we need to start telling ourselves, which is that, as Bill mentioned, a lot of our electrical and oil infrastructure was built 50 to 100 years ago. It was basically built, some of it was literally built by my great-grandfather he came from Italy and he could not read till the end of his days and called a refrigerator an icebox until he died, because these were the people who actually sacrificed out of their taxes, out of their lifestyle to build this infrastructure. And we actually need to talk about making not necessarily a similar sacrifice of going back to ice boxes, but to actually spend time on a prolonged period of investment. And we may need a big enough story to actually kick that off. Can I have other comments from other panelists about do we need to go big?
So you framed it as kind of an either go big or achieve not very much, and I don't think it's quite that way. Yeah, absolutely. We need a long-term regulatory framework, whether it's a carbon regime or stable tax credits or a renewable electricity standard. But in the meantime, there's a lot that we can be doing and should be doing. By the way, if we have a carbon regime, it takes 1 million of these things to achieve those carbon targets, right? So you have to do these things anyway. These are no regrets moves that we can do until we get a carbon regime or long-term regulatory framework. And there are things like local and state building codes, decoupling for electric utilities to profit from energy savings, the Energy Star programs and tightening efficiency standards, appliance rebates. There's 1 million different things we can do at the federal, state, and local level and through industry in the meantime. I also wanted to comment on the Congressman's comment about we really need to scale weatherization. And I know that's one of Amy's favorite topics, too. So there was a really exciting announcement. Vice President Biden announced $459 million of Department of Energy grants to state and local communities in partnership with industry to scale up weatherization in dozens of communities around the country using innovative business models, partnership structures, and financing mechanisms to really take energy efficiency retrofits of homes and businesses to scale. And they're using things like payments in lieu of taxes, so tax finance, or buying down the interest rates on very low interest consumer loans to be able to afford these things, or on-bill financing. So they're using a lot of innovative mechanisms, and these are models that can then be copied around the country.
I think that along the PACE loans that you're talking about, on-bill financing, even cash for clunkers offer very interesting ways that government can be involved in creating the financial sort of backing to create markets for these new technologies and products. Who else wants to talk about going big or?
Well, I mean, I think it's you know, I agree with the Congressman and Sanjay. I mean, I think it's got to be both. There is a gap. There's a difficulty in the energy sector for new technologies that are very large and costly or big capital projects. I mean, the sort of, not to pick on my friend in the Silicon Valley, but I mean that Silicon Valley model of, you know, you can come up with an innovation and it's individual widgets that can be around the globe. If it's software in a day, if it's a good product, that just doesn't apply to the energy sector. I was on the board of a company that was putting together a fully designed system to take excess power or sporadic power from a wind farm, use compressed air to essentially turn it into a callable resource, which would increases the value tremendously for the wind farm and increases the value tremendously to serving a load which doesn't follow the whether the wind's blowing or not. The problem is that the first, scale demonstration of this technology is hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's a very difficult finance moment because you can't really converse commercial investors. I mean, that's not a commercial project because there's too much technology risk. So there's this gap in what the model is of how you would finance that. So I think there's always going to be a role for the government. We can do that in a very smart way that doesn't really expose that doesn't cost a lot and doesn't expose the taxpayers by revolving loans or something like that. But there's got to be some way of going across this gap on some of these big projects whether it's cellulosic ethanol or it's a new kind of renewable technology. And by the way, we're doing a lot and talking to Chinese companies and partnering with them. And the 5 or 6 largest Chinese companies are in the power sector are all government owned, and it's almost like the government's a big venture capitalist. They gave each of them an assignment. You develop underground coal gasification, you develop post-combustion capture of carbon, and they are spending. I don't know how it counts against the numbers Amy's talking about, but they are spending billions and billions on R&D on these topics while we just don't have that right now. So these big projects are going to need capital and push, and we have to figure it out.
I think you bring up an interesting point, too, that we actually have a model for some government development of these things, which is the Department of Defense and NASA, which spent years, decades in partnerships with industry to develop these things. Amy, do you want to?
Sure. I think what we have to get focused on is speed and scale, and whether you care about the climate problem and recognize it's not going away and it's increasingly urgent as the science gets more and more clear, or whether you care about our vulnerability because our lack of competitiveness in the energy sector and the security issues around it. We have to act quickly, and the fastest way to do that, I would argue, is putting a price on carbon on a broadest basis possible across the economy to enable the market to find the cheapest investment opportunities to reduce those emissions. And we were talking about Silicon Valley wanting to raise energy prices. Right, but there's cost and then there's price. So you put a price on carbon, it may increase that unit price of energy, but because you're driving energy efficiency investments, overall, you drop that energy bill on a monthly basis. When you look at the analysis, the opportunity here is to increase the efficiency across the sector and overall potentially reduce energy prices if we get it done right. But in order to get it done right, to enable the most efficient investments to be made, we need that broad-based price on carbon alongside all of the pieces that we've been talking about. Particularly, I would argue, were in the original House bill. I think it was a good mix of clear signals to the marketplace. And we can't let this be state by state. When you look at our opportunities for investing in renewable energy, for instance, Kansas, a study was done, the state of Kansas could have a 200% renewable portfolio standard. They have so much. So 100% of their own and export the rest of it and have huge income opportunities, job creation opportunities in Kansas. But if you don't have the market outside of Kansas, even if they put in place their own renewable portfolio standard, you don't have that investment opportunity in Kansas. So it has to be broader than just state by state. And in South Dakota, we just installed a 120 megawatt wind project in 4 months. So these technologies can scale and deploy very quickly. But what's exciting also is they can scale incrementally, and so reducing the risk for investors. So you're not waiting 10 to 15 years for your nuclear power plant to come on board. You actually are able, and by then, where will prices be? Where will prices be for nuclear versus renewable energy at that point? And so from an investor perspective, you have a clear return on investment and predictability for your investment. So I would just say broad-based, it drives efficiency across the marketplace and creates the best opportunities for reducing costs for consumers over time.
Okay, thank you. I think the Congressman needs to leave. Do you have some final remarks you'd like to make?
First of all, I think thank you for doing the panel. It's a great topic. I think we have made what in many people's mind is a massive down payment on a clean energy future with the stimulus when we have barely touched it. We need to ask the question not where is this relative to where it's been in the past, but where does it need to get to take us where we need to go? In other words, the solutions have to be defined, or the policies have to be defined by what solves the problem, not by our sense of what's politically possible. Now, that's within the context of, understanding the difference between Washington and Silicon Valley in terms of what is possible. But at the same time, I think we do have to dare to be bold so that we are not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic as it's sinking, that we are actually, in fact, plugging the hole and starting to rebuild a stronger ship. And, just to take one example, there's some great stuff going on in terms of efficiency technology in automobiles. I think the CAFE standards, the plug-in hybrid goals, all that are important parts of it. But I think we also have to be willing to completely rethink the structure of the automobile as we know it. There are folks in our district and around the country who are rethinking how you design a car from start to finish, and believe that starting with a 2,000 or 3,000 pound battery and trying to figure out how to gain 3 to 5 miles per gallon off of that is not going to get us where we need to go. We need to start with cars that get 120 miles per gallon and then figure out the things that may take that down to 85 miles per gallon that make them commercialized. Now, we don't know yet what that car might look like and which ones might be able to be taken to scale. That's what the X Prize and things like that are about, and I think someone in our district may win that, but that's my personal opinion. But the point is, in terms of how we think about things, so much of, I think, where other countries, particularly emerging markets, are stronger is that they're not quite as entrenched in how we've been doing things, and therefore it's easier for them to imagine a different way of doing things. Whereas we have so much infrastructure invested, whether it's in the grid technology that we have, or the battery technology that we have, or the automobiles we design. We are at a moment right now where our country has always outcompeted by out-innovating. And we have to be willing to find those tweaks that are the low-hanging fruit that are really important, like weatherization, that should be the no-brainers, and be taking those to scale right away, at the same time that we're daring to wonder, in a big sense, what is outside of that box. Maybe CCS can happen, maybe it can't. We should, as a country, be willing to at least try that, because we look at problems and we say, how do we solve them? We don't back away from them. On a car, we should be looking at, these ways that a hybrid can, significantly increase. But what about getting rid of that battery altogether? What are the things that we can do in terms of the kind of engines we've been looking at, and how does that technology then trickle from, say, the auto sector, if we crack it there, into how we do jet engines or how we do appliances around the home or other things? That's the industrial revolution parallel, is that we're rethinking the very way that we do this. And our country, it's going to happen. It is going to happen. The only question is whether it's going to happen here first and we export this stuff and we build those jobs here, or whether it happens overseas and we import it all in. That's the only question. Whether it happens fast enough to not do irreparable harm, and whether it happens here or there. So I hope that we'll continue to find the low-hanging fruit, find the win-wins that are easy to be doing in the short term, but also keep thinking in a broader scale about ways we've never even thought of doing these sorts of things before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming down. Thank you. All right, next stop, low-hanging fruit. Let's talk about some of the potential places for bipartisan action on the so-called low-hanging fruit of getting more money out into the into this sector. Bill, you mentioned one possibility being to free up some capital is a different kind of tax credit involving repatriation of foreign capital. Can you lay that one out for us?
Well, yes, I can, because my CEO brings it up about every day. Duke had made investments into foreign energy companies. We didn't outsource jobs. We didn't outsource operations. This was, we can't make electricity in Brazil and ship it in. So, but we have because we are such a big capital spender in the U.S. and energy is such a big capitally intensive, whether it's in the U.S. and in Brazil. I mean, some of the ways that the current structure works in terms of recognizing foreign income makes it very difficult for us to repatriate money. I don't think we're alone in this, and so we essentially, if we bring back money from our Brazil utility, we will pay the tax in Brazil and pay it in the United States again. So it sits offshore. We're making all sorts of capital expenditures in the United States that are from smart grid to a state-of-the-art, next-generation integrated gasification combined cycle power plant for taking coal, gasifying it, running a combustion turbine, looking at carbon capture and sequestration, all of that in southern Indiana at the moment, creating thousands and thousands of jobs just doing the construction and not for all the components. So there are all these different things we would like to ramp up, and this money sits overseas. And if there was a way to allow a window of bringing that in, and those things have been done before, and they have their whole set of issues around it, but there is, and some of the problems around doing that are the scoring issues that are really very inside Washington and very artificial, because you can do studies and see that most, a percentage of this money just sits overseas, not coming back. We could get it back. We could get it and force it to be invested in clean tech and get a big spending boost right away. And we're trying to work with the administration to see if we can set that up.
Do you have a sense of what the size of that capital pile is?
It's billions of dollars. That can be. It's not the 888 that was, or whatever the exact stimulus number, but it's billions of dollars that could come in and be deployed within a year. And I think there are ways to make sure that it's incremental. I mean, make us show that a dollar brought in is actually new capital expenditure. I think there are ways to do it. And there are a whole host of companies that have these issues. From the Googles of the world to a big company like us, And there are, and I think they're also having had to, had the disadvantage of, or perhaps the advantage of, having spent a lot of my career in the Clean Air Act, and I will tell you that the Clean Air Act prepares you for the tax code. So having got into this a little bit, it's like, yes, there are ways to do this that you can sort of also sort through some things that we don't want, but people parking money in tax havens and that sort of thing. So I think it's a real opportunity to bring money back from overseas.
Sanjay or Amy, would you like to talk a little bit about some other ways to?
Well, I guess I would just want to make 2 more points.
Sure.
First of all, I think what's exciting about having a more comprehensive approach is we're increasingly seeing innovation because we're connecting the electricity sector to the transportation sector. And so you have companies that are coming in and creating whole new business models in optimizing the efficiency of both by connecting them more. So whether it's opportunities for vehicle to grid and for batteries to provide some of the services that we need for intermittent sources and other regulatory services for utilities and creating new business models around that. Or I was just this last couple of days with a number of innovators in this area, and one is a new electric truck company, and everyone thinks, batteries at that scale, can they really do that for trucks? But because of those regulating services that they can sell to utilities, it actually makes the business model work on its own. So it's incredible to see just innovative business model opportunities because we're increasingly connecting these and not continuing to silo utilities from the transportation sector. So that's
right,
one piece.
To fill in what you're saying.
Sorry.
So basically you can use the batteries in electric trucks to regulate the activities of the grid. And already utilities pay for grid regulation services. So this is one way of kind of packing a little extra incentive into the truck. You buy that, maybe your truck costs you, just off the top of my head, $50,000, but you can make maybe $5,000 a year, or less, maybe $1,000, who knows? But you can make a certain amount of money by basically renting your battery out for grid regulation services.
Actually, it's more. John Wellinghoff, even before he was chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, did a study of plug-in hybrids and showed that individual plug-in hybrid owners, and that's a small battery in a car, would garner somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a year in selling those services to the utility. So imagine what a truck can garner a year. So it actually is a significant amount of money. Second, I would just say we forget about the agriculture sector and the opportunities for carbon reductions. There are opportunities, thanks to the stimulus, to do more and more of these biodigester and other anaerobic digester technology investments, but they can also sell their ability to sequester carbon in the soils and change their land management practices and grow new crops. And that's a huge new piece of investment opportunity for the agricultural community, in addition to being paid for using their land for renewable energy as well. So I think we forget the upside. There's a lot of talk about the costs and the concerns about fuel costs for farmers, but actually there's a very large upside on that, and we don't have an economy-wide approach on carbon, or at least allow agricultural offsets within that program. We miss that opportunity for rural America.
So from a policy angle, we need to be sure that we're enabling new business models for things like the trucks, and we also need to be thinking that energy goes sort of beyond the strict energy committees and out into the agricultural committees and into whole land use practices. Sanjay, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so, you'd asked about bipartisan policies, and I think one of the things we can all agree on is the need to build up U.S. manufacturing in these high-growth industries. One of the really successful programs as part of the stimulus was $2.3 billion of tax credits jointly administered between Department of Energy and IRS for expanding manufacturing in the U.S.
Is that the 48C?
That's for Section 48C tax credits, so 30% tax credits for investments in clean energy manufacturing. And again, highly oversubscribed, more than 3-to-1 oversubscribed, and supporting then 2 times more private capital than tax credits into solar manufacturing, wind, grid, carbon capture, efficiency, batteries, vehicles, kind of all across the spectrum. You saw a lot of interest, which is great. I mean, that means there were $25 billion of projects that companies said they could build manufacturing plants in the U.S. profitably and use tax credits. That's pretty astounding. And
it also deployed very, very quickly. Deployed in like 6 months or something. Right.
And so President Obama called for another $5 billion for that program. And one of the things that was interesting to me is we think about manufacturing going overseas to take advantage of low labor costs. And actually, when you ask manufacturers why they locate overseas, they point to something long before that. because low labor costs usually come with low labor productivity, they point to investment tax credits that are available overseas, and they point to availability of low-cost financing as the key reasons they invest overseas. There's no reason we can't do that here. So that, to me, sounds like a great bipartisan issue.
And from my own perspective, I would also throw another possibility in is having some sort of consumer finance bank like a Carby May that essentially helps consumers finance very efficient or very or small-scale energy generation equipment in their homes or in their cars as a way of reaching kind of the middle-class consumers. A lot of our tax credits for solar panels or even Priuses or plug-in hybrids tend to go towards a higher-income consumer because that's who's paying the taxes and that's who can get the credit to buy the expensive car. And what we actually need is something, what we could do to create markets is create kind of a Carby May type arrangement in which we have government-backed loans for at a low cost to deploy that stuff out into communities. I want to break to go to audience questions. The first question, is Beth Viola here? Oh, okay. Do you want to talk a little bit to her, to the experience that you've had with working with some of the clean tech startups? Do you want to introduce yourself? There's a microphone.
This is David Mann.
And maybe in the frame of a question.
Listening to the panel discussion, I'd like to thank you all for your wonderful presentations. We've had a great diversity of perspectives on the issue. There are a couple of technology sectors that have been mentioned and a couple that haven't. We just talked briefly about anaerobic digestion, and waste to energy comes to mind as well, but also industrial energy efficiency as really large areas that may have been overlooked by the stimulus and perhaps overlooked broader by the clean energy sector and particularly government regulations. So I'm curious to have your comments on these three sectors and anything else that's been left out, both by the stimulus and as we go forward.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Industrial efficiency is great because not only can it help reduce carbon emissions, but it also helps make our industries more cost competitive at the same time while creating jobs. So it's a threefer. There was $155 million in DOE's Recovery Act programs for industrial efficiency, and it was matched 2-to-1 by private capital. And they did things like putting in combined heating and power units instead of using grid power or burning fossil fuels to create steam for process heat. They used waste heat. Or they used combined heat and power. So one example of that is the largest steel mill in the United States is near Gary, Indiana. It's run by ArcelorMittal. And in their largest steam furnace, or blast furnace, which is the largest blast furnace in North America, it generates a lot of blast furnace gas. And that has to be combusted so it doesn't contribute to greenhouse gases. But they weren't using that to create power and process heat. So they installed a unit supported by these grants to use like 80% of that blast furnace gas. And the net effect, it's reducing their cost of steel by $5 a ton. So there's just a lot of potential. That, again, was very oversubscribed, and it would be great to be able to do more of that.
I mean, this, though, I agree completely about the availability of this sector. And, you know, another company that I led an investment into prior to when I returning to Duke was a company that made small end heat compressors and expanders, and it was all about the whole play was about trying to increase efficiency and make compressors and expanders that were designed for small applications, because in a world where carbon and efficiency, energy efficiency count, all sorts of small, waste heat from a large apartment heating air conditioning unit would have value, but there wasn't technology to address that. So there are companies out there that are trying to do this, but you still got to figure out how to get the right signals to people. And I'm hoping that the steel company that was just mentioned isn't in our service territory. I'm sure we would have, at one level in the company, taken the point of view of oh my goodness, there goes some huge load that we were going to serve because they're going to generate power. And so we got to get all, there's probably an inherent part of this where the existing power structure is a loser, that, that's fine, that's capitalism. But if we could get signals around that where we could make money providing that solution, I think that'll push it faster too. So
to interject, obviously one of the issues is a competitive issue and a regulatory issue with getting that on the grid. But there is this enormous waste heat recovery happens to be one of my darlings. And one of the ideas that I've worked on is whether or not we could have sort of a TVA type arrangement looking at the waste heat that's available from industrial sites in the South and Midwest, which appear to have 69 nuclear plants worth of productive capacity that would be profitable, or at least economically reasonable to recover. Obviously, you can't really get the 69 nukes worth of it. It would be less than that, but that's just this extraordinary resource, and we kind of have to work out the regulatory and financing of and grid framework to get at that stuff. But it just makes so much sense. It's crazy that we don't do it. Amy, maybe you'd like to talk to something other than waste heat recovery.
Well, smart grid, another favorite topic of all of ours. I was just going to say that same issue around the decoupling and the matching the incentives is a huge issue for the smart grid and driving opportunities for demand response and giving consumers that information and therefore changing their behavior. And there's very, very little incentive for the utilities to be encouraging that reduction of consumption unless you have decoupling, a way for them to make money off of incentivizing reduced electricity consumption. And then also time of use pricing is another signal that we're not seeing, and so consumers aren't getting the right signals to adjust their own behavior. But even in France, they did a study of smart grid, and all they did was just give them the information about their power use and how much they were using, and it was 30% of the customers received that information, and it dropped overall energy use by 10%. And it's dramatic just by giving the information, but imagine combining that with the incentives to drive more efficiency, more conservation, and the time of use pricing and what that could do to change behavior. So I think we get excited about the smart grid, but if we don't have these regulatory changes and the right signals, we're going to miss out on those opportunities. Right. And those are near term, very fast.
And I think the other opportunity in the smart grid is for inventors along the lines of Ron Popeil of the Popeil Pocket Fishermen and the Stovetop Rotisserie. These people who look at kind of the way we use energy or with the way we use appliances in our homes and dream up new things we'd really love to have. And I think that once they get tuned into the smart grid and sort of click in on the combination of being able to save money and being able to control how you use power and being able to deliver something to consumers, we may have sort of one of those sort of flowerings of bizarre contraptions that we can use in our homes that ultimately re-engineer things in ways that we haven't thought of. More questions from the audience. Yes, you in the back.
Hi, Michael Nix with PJM. Ms. Christensen, really like your concept about the wind power. Excuse me, really like your your concept about the powering the electric vehicles. PJM is part of MAGIC, Mid-Atlantic Grid Integration Car Consortium, where we're doing not only that, using the batteries to keep us at 60 hertz, but adding on to this, we can bring in Midwest wind, charge the batteries at night, zero fuel cost. It's something we're very much looking into right now. To your point about showing customers the true cost of electricity and the time you're doing this. PJM's pushing a concept now called price responsive demand, which we always use this dishwasher example where if you want to run your dishwasher at 3 in the afternoon, that's fine, and we'll charge you, the local utility will charge you 12 cents kilowatt hour. But if you run it at 11 o'clock at night or midnight, maybe electricity will be 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. We've got to work this, I guess, through the state commissions. This isn't something we do at the federal level since we still regulate electricity very much at the state level. It seems like our approach has been we've been taking it to state commissions with some of our 560 member companies that are doing business in these state commissions and trying to work it there. You mentioned earlier you don't see us, or you do see us, hopefully having a carbon price. I'd love to share your optimism, but I've lobbied up here a little too much. I don't. Without legislation that shows us a carbon price, what do we do? And I throw that to the entire panel, specifically Mr. Tyndall. Love to hear what Duke's thinking about that.
Right. I just quickly respond, because in the stimulus legislation, there was actually a call for states actually to pursue decoupling, and I think even time of use pricing was in there, and it wasn't held up as a obligation or requirement to receive the stimulus funding, even though in theory it was supposed to be. I'm just curious from Sanjay's perspective where that stands, because it is obviously a state-by-state regulatory issue, but we use that stimulus opportunity to incentivize them to go down those paths.
So we before states could get their stimulus funds from Department of Energy, we had to get a letter from each governor saying that they had approved plans to put in place decoupling and plans to put in place green building codes. So it wasn't a hard requirement that there are codes and decoupling, but plans in place. You know, we eventually got them from all 50, with the last one being Alaska, where does that stand? I mean, we have to follow up on that and make sure they get, and you know, they are asking for technical assistance.
Right.
So
that also brings up, you know, one of the big issues with the smart grid is all the 50 state PUCs and all of the different arrangements between all the utilities, and it brings up this. I think of it as sort of as the Mothers Against Drunk Driving model, in which you kind of withhold funds until people come up to the minimum code, which is what was done with highway funds. And so there are sort of other levers to pursue for moving towards the smart grid, or something that is a more uniform smart grid across the country. Bill, did you want to respond to this?
Well, on the question of sort of a future with ambivalent or ambiguous carbon signal, I think, you know, in the last year, we've had to do a lot of explaining about our position, because we've been we were original founder of US CAP and have worked very hard for trying to find a solution here that worked for our ratepayers, worked for our shareholders, and worked for the environment. And we still are in real time involved in trying to do something this year, but who knows if it's going to pass. But in responding, you know, Jim, our CEO, took a lot of criticism for, you know, why is a big energy company, 50% of your generation is coal? Why, you know, how does this make sense? And we started looking at all the things we were thinking about doing in smart grid and solar on the rooftop, national wind development, and all of them, and even nuclear power and some other things we're looking at, all these options we're creating. Really, you can get there without a carbon price. They're driven by other things. Whether it's criteria pollutants, where we expect EPA to have a whole new series of requirements around NOx, mercury, and SO2, whether it's high energy prices, whether it's foreign competition driving down, creating always a need for manufacturers to lower their costs, whether it's just the fact that we have an aging fleet of power plants and we're going to replace all of them. So what are we going to replace them with? And you know, that will drive a lot of capital, a lot of turnover, and the reality of that turnover is something with a high carbon profile generally has both a risk that at some point we will do something on climate, even if we don't do it this year, and generally that means it has a lot of inefficiency built into it. So it's not going to be the winning technology as we're seeing. So, you know, when you went through the whole list of all these things we were doing, the only thing that really you wouldn't do if there was no climate bill is go in and start the process of thinking of retrofitting existing coal-fired power plants with carbon capture and sequestration. And that's about it. Everything else we're doing, smart grid, renewables, next generation, all make sense whether there's no climate bill or whether there is one. So.
Next question. The gentleman in the middle.
Kelly Kuwayama. I'm retired for 20 years or so. But anyway, Mr. Tyndall suggested this in his remark, that we are still in a capitalistic system, I believe, and since we are, that the price might be a moving force in the marketplace. And if that is so, if we made gasoline per gallon cost, let's say $5, that would cut off the whole gasoline business and the fossil fuel business, and it might spark innovation upon the private enterprise system to get other types of energy going, because it would be profitable to do so, either wind, or solar, or geothermal, or whatever means you might have. What do you, the panel already has conceived probably and discarded the possibility, since it is so great a change, that the price could be taxed of fossil fuel usage in the oil industry or in any other fossil fuel industry.
Okay, thank you.
Raise the price to such an extent that it would be profitable to use for other means of energy production.
Great. That's the transformative possibilities of a catastrophe.
I mean, it's just a quick, Karen
Yeah.
Whalen from Speaker Pelosi's office snuck in, and then she snuck out. I would have, I would love to have punted this to her. But, there is, right now, under consideration in the Senate energy bill that Senators Kerry Graham and Lieberman are trying to put together, there is consideration of a system of what are called linked fees, where the price, the oil companies are charged an amount that reflects the carbon content of the gasoline they are selling, and that may or may not make it into the final bill, and that may or may not set off World War III as some new fuel tax, which has a lot, which economists tend to think is a really nifty idea, and politicians and voters are not quite sold on it. So,
yeah, I think it's hard
mildly.
I think it's hard to conceive of an energy policy that prevents people from getting to work, and until we figure out some way to get people to work without using so much gasoline, it's hard to imagine really sending prices up. Did you want to say something?
Something quick. I mean, it's interesting that gas prices are $5 or higher in Europe and India and lots of other places around the world. And what that means is the first generation of electric vehicles will actually be economic from the start. They won't be here. What we have to do is make sure to get battery prices down as quickly as possible. We're estimating that by 2020, electric vehicles will, the premium won't be so large, and you'll be, saving in a reasonable amount of time electricity costs versus gas costs, even if gas prices stay at today's levels. So we need to get to that point quickly.
That's a really important point, the sort of competitive disadvantage of low energy prices here. Amy, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to say an alternative to that is to actually setting a price floor per barrel of oil, and that is increasingly gaining a pretty broad spectrum of support from interesting places like the car companies as well as the oil industry. So it allows for a greater level of predictability about what would be the potential bottom of that competitiveness and pricing against gasoline. So at least you have that level of predictability for investors in the cleaner technologies.
Okay. So I want to move on to wrap this up very quickly by asking the panel members to just say briefly kind of where they see a lot of hope in this situation, which direction. And I'm just going to say this one thing that I find very hopeful about if we can really push and keep the momentum on clean tech is that we may unlock an enormous amount of families' spending and free it up, move it away from energy and move it towards other things. And I'll just offer you this example from the city of Fresno, which realized that its families who have a fairly low median income, they have a terrible pollution problem. 1 in 3 kids in the county has asthma. They realized that the community was spending $750 million a year on utility payments. And they realized that a lot of that actually has to do with poorly connected air conditioning ducts. And they could do a lot as a city to sort of reconnect the ducts, both literally and figuratively, and reduce that spending by perhaps $250 million, which would be cycling that money back into the economy and effectively raising families' disposable incomes by $1,500, which is something that you simply cannot do by fiat. And you can't give people at that tax level, you can't give them a tax rebate of $1,500 either. So there is this enormous potential to sort of move people's spending away from things that kind of leave the community and back towards the community here. And that to me is one of the really hopeful things here, is that if we can look at this big enough, in a big enough way, we will find enormous reservoirs of new things in addition to dealing with the carbon issue. I'd like to ask the other panel members if you can talk about, the thing that gives you a lot of hope. Amy.
All right. So I came out to government from Silicon Valley, and so the part of the Recovery Act programs that I helped oversee, that is my favorite, is ARPA-E. So Lisa mentioned DARPA, referred to DARPA earlier, so this is a DARPA for energy. And here's what happened. They issued their first solicitation for $150 million for high-risk, high-reward, far-out, crazy technology projects. And they're expecting a few hundred, maybe 1,000. They got 3,700 applications totaling $22 billion in research projects. All kinds of far-out, really exciting ideas. They funded 37 of them. And the idea is that even if 2 or 3 of them end up working, we can have game changers like things that came out of DARPA, like ARPANET became the internet, Tether became GPS, stealth technology, unmanned aerial vehicles, real game changers, and we can have that in energy. And you look at these ideas, they're really exciting. So Bill mentioned the fact that it takes hundreds of millions of dollars to scale it up. I don't think that's such a big deal. I mean, we've been doing that in biotech for a long time. It takes $500 million plus to bring a new drug to market in 10 to 14 years. Energy technology isn't quite that capital intensive and lengthy, so we can definitely do it.
Well, I would say, and I don't, to the best of my knowledge, have an application in front of him, but I would say it gives me a little hope when somebody really smart from the Silicon Valley drops everything and comes and works for our government for a couple of years and in an important time in an important area. We took about 40 homes in North Carolina, in Charlotte, and we totally wired them up to a smart grid, smart appliances, smart meters, fuel cells, and a whole sort of integrated system. And one of the things we discovered was we were able to manage a 20% reduction in electric consumption without the homeowners even noticing it. So, there's hope out there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I'm going last because I kept thinking of new things that were giving me hope as I was sitting here. So I think, first of all, having worked on this issue for about 17 years now, what gives me greatest hope is that the increased awareness and understanding of it is bringing the best minds to bear on the challenge, people like Sanjay and others who are working on this, and that gives me a great deal of hope for innovation and solving the problem. I would say, second, it is utilities partnering with clean tech companies and seeing that, finding those new business opportunities together, so interesting new partnerships that are being created. And then finally, it's that business leaders are taking responsibility for coming to the Hill, educating Congress, spending time here and recognizing the value of that and the importance of that for creating the best regulatory frameworks that we can for getting this job done. So we had 250 business leaders here in October, more than that here in February, and the learning that's happening in those conversations, dramatic. I don't know if it's in time to ensure we have an optimal bill coming out this year, but I think we can get started right now and then build on that over time.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the audience for coming all the way down into the bowels here. And thank you to our panel for a very interesting discussion and hopefully the first of many.
If you give me